Greetings, traveler from beyond the fog. I am Melina.
I love the Soul series. I don't think that's a hot topic. God knows that the last time I said something even remotely controversial, it was like the most divisive videos I've ever made. But I don't want to talk about that today. Instead, did y'all know that yeah, so the DLC is like really good, and I don't think it takes like a rocket scientist or anything to figure that out. And a part of me wants to say that From Software is kind of the golden standard whenever it comes to how they handle their DLCs. Every one of their expansions for each and every one of their games seems to elevate not only the wider game feel, but also the base game to such a degree that it just kinda permanently revitalizes the game to a sort of mythic status each and every time. When they add a new DLC, the new roster to enemies, weapons, bosses, spells, and all those other things sort of permanently change your routing, especially on repeat playthroughs. And Shadows of the Erdtree is yet another good example of this. I love all of the soul-centered games that From Software has ever made. Even you, the weird Harlequin baby that nobody seems to like. And all of the DLCs and expansions just add so much to each and every one of these games, to the point where it seems like whenever a new Souls game comes out, the entire player base sort of asks, as a community, when's the DLC coming out? And that's sort of insane, right? It just goes to show you how revered these individual expansions are. But even still, Elden Ring has its detractors. Every game does, for sure, but specifically in the case of Elden Ring, a lot of the same people who liked the Souls games don't like Elden Ring. And often I find that the cases they make for not liking Elden Ring are perfectly justified. It goes without saying that Elden Ring is sort of a paradigm shift, right? At least in terms of the wider Souls franchise. But I would also like to posit that Elden Ring's expansion is also a paradigm shift. A lot of the expansion's elements are sort of departures from Elden Ring itself, and I'd like to take that time today to sort of talk about what that means for Elden Ring going forward, because I have some things to say today that are maybe worth consideration. So if you'll continue to humor me, because this intro has been going on for far too long anyway, let's go ahead and get to talking about it. Also, spoilers for Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree, obviously. You know, it's kinda weird that there's not a cutscene introducing the Shadowlands or anything. Like, I know there was that cutscene prior where you're touching Miquella's arm and everything, and I know that they're also going for that feeling where it's like playing Elden Ring for the first time, opening that gate and seeing the wide open world and stuff, but I don't know, something about this feels kinda weird. The Souls series has always had kind of a focus on build crafting, right? Every subsequent release kind of gives you more options as you're going along too, whether that be new tools or new stats to play with, or new types of weapons, or just it can be anything. From Software is always expanding and moving up in terms of the options that you have. And sort of a perfect microcosm of this is the expansions that come out for each and every one of these games. When a new DLC comes out for a Souls game, you'd be an utter fool if you didn't at least consider what that DLC gives you in terms of options for whatever build you're making. And the same applies here to Elden Ring as well. But equipment is also where we start getting our first weird little hiccup, I guess. It's not a bad thing, it's just it's weird. Never before has a Souls DLC introduced entirely new weapon types, up until Elden Ring. You could make the argument that Dark Souls 3 had a couple of weird splinter weapons that belong in their own type, the Ring Knight paired great swords or Valor Hard and stuff like that. But there's a pretty important distinction there. They're not in their own weapon type. They're splinters of existing weapon types. Shadow of the Erdtree introduces 8 new weapon types for you to have access to, which is kind of a lot. Really going from 0 to 100 there, huh? The thing I want to focus on with the new weapon types is specifically that they're only relegated to the DLC. As a result of this, a lot of the new weapon types kind of feel shallow, more or less. There's a couple of types in here that only have like 2 options or less for weapons that you have access to. And they are fully functional, they're fully fleshed out and everything, the weapons themselves anyway. But in terms of weapons in those individual types that you want, ones that work with your build, it can feel kind of anemic just because there isn't very much to choose from there, if anything at all. Exhibit A, perfume bottles literally having 0 specs for strength scaling at all. Like, really? I mean, sure. These all definitely seem like Dex arcane weapons, but I don't know, that just... no strength scaling doesn't sit right with me. Oh, but Ian, the other new weapon types have plenty of options for really simple, one-size-fits-all kind of weapons that every build can use. Okay, sure, you're right. But why do all these have to be in the DLC anyway? I know the answer, it's because they didn't think of the idea until they wanted to implement it for the DLC. But did it really have to take until the mid-game-ish area for your character to finally figure out how to flip a curved sword and start using it like that? Like, that comes off as really silly to me. With the update that actually brought all of these weapons in, they probably could have just put the really basic ones in the vanilla game as sort of a demo almost, so that you can get more specialized versions in the DLC. That would have been kind of cool. $40 is kind of a big asking price for an expansion, and even though I do feel it is warranted for how high quality it is, and how big it is, it's nonetheless still a high asking price. It's probably the most definitive negative out of the whole experience, is just how high the price is. And actually, while we're on the topic of equipment, I have to say something real fast. All of the new weapons, whether or not they are part of a new weapon type, work perfectly fine and as intended. Maybe they're a little overtuned, but there's no weak options as far as I can tell. At least no unusably weak options anyway. I can't say the same thing for the spells. There's a couple of spells in the DLC that are just completely worthless. And in an expansion, where the total runtime is less than the main game, of which the devs feel the need to make whole new spell schools for, these spells really can't afford to be bad, because it means a third or more of the entire spell school is just completely useless for everybody, and that's not good. Rain of Fire being as bad as it is completely unforgivable, and they need to fix it. This is pathetic. And Impenetrable Thorns being as strong as it is needs to be stopped, or it's going to take over the entire world, I swear. Okay, let's just chill out a little bit. It's fine. I know that how the weapons are implemented is a little weird, but ultimately it's okay. And I also understand that the spells will eventually be fixed. It just kind of baffles me because out the gate all of the weapons are perfectly serviceable, even in the worst case scenario. But hopefully in the future things will be brought to their proper place here soon. So there's a large part of me that believes that Shadow Tree fragments are going to be pretty much the sole reason anybody groans whenever they start the DLC. I'd like to propose a thought experiment real fast. Say you're From Software. Your entire team just released one of the most acclaimed video games to ever exist. At least in terms of your company, anyway. But because of how long the DLC is taking to make, the player base for your game has already beaten this game several times over. But you really need to make that DLC. So how do you go about balancing the difficulty of the expansion to make it to where everybody has a fair level of challenge in it? Enter the Shadow Tree fragment. Look, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily feel like explaining how these things work in detail, but since I am making a video essay, I am obligated to explain their really basic functionality. In a sense, they increase your attack and defense only inside the DLC. They act as collectibles, essentially. You run around, you find a couple of them, you pop them at a grace, your damage goes up, your defense goes up. On the one hand, they work to the benefit of the entire modus operandi of Elden Ring as a whole, which is to say if you're struggling with something, run around and explore some more and come back later. Obviously the Shadow Tree fragments are the most tangible example of this, but nonetheless they get that part of the job done. Even still though, the reason I kind of think this is an inelegant way to gate progression, so to say, is because unless you're a challenge runner, the DLC expects you to collect at least a certain number of these in order to be able to actually survive anything in the game. Weirdly though, this is more or less the same issue that the vanilla game faces, only replace the fragments with instead sacred tears and golden seeds. Sure, you probably don't need all of them, you might not need any of them if you're good enough. But that's just not most people, and it's sort of the biggest pain point to repeat playthroughs in this game anyway. And it kinda sucks that the DLC doesn't do anything to alleviate this necessarily. And I'm willing to bet fragments are going to put DLC players in sort of the same situation. It makes the sort of long, arduous slog parts of the game be a larger, more arduous slog, and that doesn't really sit right with me either. In sort of the opposite vein though, the DLC feels a lot more compact comparatively. Without really doing any maths or measurement here, the DLC is only like a third of the base game in terms of just comparing the sizes of them both. That's 1/3 extra of Elden Ring, which is cool by itself, but I feel like they do a lot more with the space that they're given. Like yeah, the vanilla game has a lot of really pretty vistas that are cool to look at, but you get pretty tired of running through those pretty vistas on your second or third character with nothing to do. If your goal is to get to A to Z, there's no way to expedite this process, and if you have to go through the DLC for any reason, barring the use of Erdtree fragments, it feels like there's just more going on here, in a lot shorter of a time frame anyway. And in general, I think that's a pretty good thing. There's a lot less aimless wandering, not getting anything done, and not feeling like you're doing anything to further your playthrough. Overall, it just feels more concise, and that's a really good thing. You could say the map kinda trims the fat in the DLC. And speaking of trimming the fat, the DLC has like lesser dungeon equivalents. The ruined forges kind of act like heroes' graves. And the DLC's version of jails are kind of like the caves almost. For one, they're visually distinct, which helps to re-liven up the discovery aspect of them. And if we're comparing these as replacements, then if you ask me, it seems like a good thing that there's so much less of them, basically. My primary argument for this is basically because there's so many more of them in the vanilla game. If you're trying to get a specific equipment piece from one of these lesser dungeons, just in terms of trying to fit a specific equipment piece in with your build, then it can feel kind of really disparate, basically. If you're trying to do, like, a gravity build, basically, and one of the gravity sorceries is all the way in the end game, even though most of the spells are in the early to mid game, then yeah, I'd argue it's gonna get really annoying to try to get every piece of your build whenever they're so far away. Now look, I do understand that if everything was just in the same spot and your build was ready to go from the word go, then that would be kind of lame and wouldn't feel like you earned it necessarily. The argument I make for the DLC handling this better is simply because the time in between it takes to get individual gear pieces is much shorter. You still feel like you earn it, but it's not so far away that you have to plan like a road trip or anything to go get it. Again, it just feels more concise. We're almost done with this segment, but I have one more thing I need to talk about. So bringing up smithing stones in this segment is going to run the risk of this being kind of unnecessary to talk about, but I actually think it's a pretty important thing that further elevates the DLC's design. So yeah, at least in terms of my playthroughs and playthroughs of other people I played with, we get kind of a lot of smithing stones here. Basically anytime that we're playing the DLC, we get smithing stones of every level pretty much everywhere. This obviously helps expedite the process of getting the new weapons you want to experiment with upgraded to a level that's comparable to the rest of your equipment. But arguably more important is the amount of ancient dragon smithing stones you get. Let me give you some numbers real quick. In the base game of Elden Ring, there are 13 ancient dragon smithing stones. Many of these are relegated to NPC quest lines, which are either missable or you could just mess them up pretty easily. And if neither of those, then they're pretty out of the way. Comparatively, there are 8 stones in the DLC. Remember that the DLC is only about a third of the entire runtime of the base game of Elden Ring. And that's not even talking about the Sombers, because that gets crazy. The base game has 8 Somber stones, and the rules for how to get them apply the same way as the regular Ancient Somber smithing stones do, with the added issue of there being less of them. The DLC adds an additional 6 stones to this list, and you really do feel the increase. Most of the times in the expansion, all you have to do to get these stones is just like kill a boss or go somewhere. And hey, what do you know, as a result you're just going to find more of these laying around. Comparing the ratios between the base game and the expansion gets ridiculous. Again, by nature the DLC it's much shorter, so to see roughly the same amount of stones in a game time that's just going to be not as long as the base game, like, wow, okay. I see this as sort of a definitively good thing. The ancient stones are finite, and you never really need more than a couple for basically any build that you're doing. But if you felt like experimenting with a build with a different weapon, it gives you a lot more breathing room to be able to do that now. and I kinda wish all of the Souls DLCs did this. You're lucky to see like a Titanite slab at the end of a DLC for basically any other Souls expansion, but in Shadow of the Erdtree they're basically just everywhere. And I hope going forward with more Souls expansions, this continues to be sort of a commonplace thing. I think the reason for adding so many smithing stones in the DLC was likely because you can play the DLC at just about any level range, barring very early game basically. And yeah, being able to expedite the process of upgrading your tools and equipment is just amazing. And one little last thing at the end here, the DLC also adds in more larval tiers too, so if you're running out of those for respecking, then you got some extra to work with here now as well. I got a snow cone! Yay, snow cone! Alright, so let's talk about world bosses. Or rather, the lack thereof. The base game of Elden Ring has a lot of world bosses, which is to say, bosses that don't have a fog gate that you can just literally walk in on whenever you're walking around in the overworld. Shadow of the Erdtree has notably fewer of these, and the ones that they do have are not a whole lot to write home about. Namely, the furnace golems. I don't really like fighting these, and I don't think anybody really does. They're more or less supposed to be the replacement for the Erdtree avatars, but instead of being a engaging, learnable fight with some stakes involved because it's a competent boss, it's a 5-minute giant damage sponge that just basically requires you to pay attention to it for the entire length of time you're fighting it, which is, again, like 5 minutes, else suffer dying and having to do it all over again. The reason I say they're kind of the analog to the Erdtree avatars is because they drop the physic tiers. There's a bunch of new ones of these too, and the furnace golems are holding them. And just to be clear here, not all the furnace golem fights are boring and lame. It's just the unarmored ones that aren't very good. If you have to run up and hit it in the legs a bunch until it eventually goes down, it's not very fun. The ones that are armored, the ones that have plates protecting their legs and you can't necessarily slash at them, instead have spirit springs that you have to jump on top of and use as an arena, basically. These give you different areas to work with, different real estate space and all that, but even these fights aren't necessarily super engaging. They're just kind of tolerable, which is still fine, but it doesn't really feel like a boss fight. The furnace golems kind of feel more like architecture, basically. They feel like part of the environment that you interact with as more of a trap, more or less. One that you just so happen to be able to fight and be rewarded for doing. And because they drop specific tiers, then it could be seen as sort of a crux to your build, and yeah, that means you have to fight at least one of these. At least throwing the giant pots into the open heads of the furnace golems is cool. But yeah, I don't know. I think if it were me in charge of making this somehow, I would basically make it to where you only fight one unarmored golem. The rest would be armored. Maybe do a thing where you give them a couple more moves in their moveset or something. Maybe play with the arenas that you have to jump on top of. Maybe one can be in like a canyon or something, and you have to use spirit springs to jump on top of 3 platforms you can get to that are all pretty small, so that whenever they do their giant fire AoE attack, you have to jump back down and jump onto another platform or something. I don't know, just something to make it more engaging. Make them stand out a little bit more. Because at least with the Erdtree avatars, they had a little something going on with different variants to the avatars. As it stands though, probably just avoid the furnace golems if you don't need to fight them or don't feel like fighting them, because odds are you won't and you don't need to. Look up what tiers they drop and force yourself to fight them if you really want the tiers. This whole problem is not the end of the world or anything, obviously, but I do kind of feel like the furnace golems are a particularly big stain on your experience if you're going out of your way and fighting them, if you need to fight them. If you're trying not to use a wiki or anything, for example, you have no idea what they drop and you're incentivized to do it at least once. When you figure out it's a tier, and you are still insistent on not spoiling yourself, now you want to go and try to fight every single one of these, but there's not a good strategy to fight the unarmored ones. The intention is to try to break their stance, get them on the ground so that you can riposte them. But there's at least a couple of these furnace golems that make it really hard to riposte them because of how big they are, and because of how they're standing on inclines. Being able to riposte on stairs in Souls games has been sort of this weird hiccup all throughout the series, but it definitely feels particularly prevalent on an enemy so big that's so contingent on your ability to riposte them. But I don't know, maybe we get lucky and they patch this somehow or make it to where it's easier to fight them. I kind of doubt it. I think the fights are fundamentally flawed, but if you can make them at least more tolerable to fight, then I mean it'll go a long way to actually enjoying that part of the DLC. Let's go ahead and move on. I'm tired of talking about these things.
My loyal blade and champion of the festival. Those your deeds will ever be praised in song. Now, the vow will be honored, and my your brother's soul will return. So that he may be my consort.
The Souls games are hard, until they're not. Difficulty in Souls games is one of the most hotly debated topics pretty much since the series started, and you probably don't need me to tell you that. With each new game that From Software releases, the general difficulty only seems to go up as time goes on. With Shadow of the Erdtree being the most recent Souls things to come out of From Software, it's pretty hard all across the board. I think it's pretty safe to say you're pretty guaranteed to struggle with at least most of the Remembrance bosses inside the DLC. And if you're somehow looking for my opinion on the difficulty of the DLC, well, I don't know, I guess it's appropriate, right? All across both the base game and the DLC, we've been fighting gods and demigods. They have wide-reaching significance in both their stories and the stories of other characters within the game itself. They're divinity, it's supposed to be difficult to defeat them. The DLC really does like to make a point to make these fights as hard as possible though. The sheer spectacle of a lot of these fights is going to give you a 1,000-yard stare of, do you really want me to fight that, basically? But I honestly can't help but just marvel at that idea. The Souls series has never been one to hold your hand. You're lucky to even find something that gives you an edge in any of these fights. At least in the case of Elden Ring, you can decide to go and fight something else if whatever boss you're fighting currently is giving you too much trouble. This is the biggest reason why a lot of people say that Elden Ring is the easiest Souls game. And yeah, if you're thinking about that statement just on its face, then it's gonna sound really silly. I personally don't think that any of these games are easy necessarily, but I also don't think that any of them are brutally, unfairly difficult either. All of these games ask for something different from you, with the common through line obviously being persistence and determination, the indomitable human spirit and all that, and that on its face is pretty powerful. It's the sort of feeling that lends credence to how difficult these enemies are versus you actually being able to defeat them and feeling like you really earned it. It's why so many non-Souls players see Souls players as terrible masochists, basically. But I think the truth is that we just want to find reward through hardship, because there's a fair argument to say that that's the best kind of reward. The hardest of these bosses are not a hurdle, or even a hill. They're a brick wall, really. Ones we're expected to take down not with a drill, but a pickaxe. And the pickaxes that we're given might be too big and heavy, they might be too small and flimsy, but ultimately we either make it work or we find something different to break it down with. And that's how I see these fights, that's how I see the hardship, and the sort of reward at the end of it all too. And I personally see no better example of this than the DLC's final and most difficult boss.
At long last you are returned.
I think it's safe to say that Radahn is probably the hardest fight in all of Souls history thus far. The Radahn fight is a fight so hard, it'll put hair on your chest no matter who you are. Ridiculous, absolutely baffling damage and speed of something so large. The Radahn Phase 2 fight is all of that turned up to 250%. He moves even faster, he has even more damage, most of his attacks have AoE now, and they even gave him a grab attack just as a cherry on top of it, I guess. But even with all this increase in difficulty, the satisfaction from actually beating this fight is twofold. I'm gonna let y'all in on a little secret. Radahn has nothing on you. Throughout all of the games, every single one of the bosses and even all of the enemies have been fighting an uphill battle. You coming into these arenas and fighting these bosses and winning is an inevitability. All you have to do is try, and sometimes you have to try quite a bit more than others. If you don't feel like you can do it right now, just come back and try again later. You can go and fight something else, get more powerful, bring in some sort of crux that you think might help. But at the end of the day, you're the one with the pickaxe. You will break down that wall. That's why you're here. Before there was Promised Consort Radahn, there was Melania. Before her, it was Ishin. Before that, Genichiro. Then Dark Eater Midir. Then it was Gale. Then it was Kos. Then Fume Knight. Then Calamite. Then Flame Lurker. These are some of the hardest bosses in Souls history. And whether or not you played any of the games where these bosses appeared in, one thing remains certain. They can be beaten. I've never really talked about story in any game that I've talked about for this channel, and I'm not about to start now. But one thing I do know about the DLC story is that Miquella and Radahn by extension are doomed to fail. And that's primarily because they're fighting you, a being who will die and come back to life time and time again until their job is done. That's how all of these games work. And I think there's solace to take from that, because at the end of the day, all you have to do is try, and don't stop trying. Okay, video's done now. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the AC back on. There we go. I might have come off as a little too hard on some of the aspects of the DLC, and I guess just the wider game in general. Most of the bosses are ridiculously brutal. The Shadow Tree fragments perpetuate the issue of replayability. A good handful of the spells are disbalanced, and Furnace Golems in general are just not fun to fight. But sort of the reason I'm even critical of all this stuff in the first place is because I like this game. Shadow of the Erdtree, like all of the Souls expansions before it, revitalizes the base game, which is saying something, because it's not like the player bases for any of these games are particularly thin or anything. And I'm only critical about aspects of the game because I like it so much. I'd like to think I'm only critical in a way that only someone with love in their heart could be. Because none of these games are perfect, but man, wouldn't it be cool if it was? I really do think the expansions in these games should set the bar for how good a DLC should be, at least if the dev team has comparable manpower, or even more. A lot of the magic from these expansions comes from the fact that they elevate the base game, not just it being a good experience on its own. And I can't really say the same for most other games with expansions in them, I'm gonna be honest. Because I don't know about y'all, but this DLC is exactly the thing that I needed in order to pick up Elden Ring again. Because I really do love this game, and the series. Warts and all. And yeah, I guess that's everything. Real fast, I just want to mention, all of this footage has been making use of the Seamless Co-op mod, which I'll link in the description if you haven't heard about it or if you haven't played it yet. If you have some friends to tag along with you, it's a really good way to get back into the game and have a new sort of perspective on how to play it. I also just want to give special thanks to the Flexter Life wiki. All the images used for the equipment types and the spells and stuff all come from the website, so, you know, there's that. And yeah, with all that being said, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. If you like this video and want to see more, then like and subscribe because I upload every Friday. And if you feel like donating $1 a month, then I also have a Patreon. Donating will give you access to a Discord and also have your name at the end of these videos. Of course, if you don't feel like doing either of those, then that's fine too. Just thanks for watching this far in. It means a lot to me, honestly. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up now. Why did I make this video so long? Have a good one, y'all.